Hello, folks, and welcome to this session of the Master Commercial Poultry Producer Program. I'm Tom Tabler. I'm Poultry Specialist with UT Extension and UT Ag Research, and today we're talking about biosecurity protocols for poultry farms. Now, I've done a lot of biosecurity talks since 2015, and I know it's not the most exciting topic to talk about, but biosecurity is critically important, and it's the best defense we have for keeping our flock safe and not letting disease get on our farm, or if it does get on our farm, not letting it spread to other folks' farm. So with that, let's get started. So what exactly is biosecurity? Well, bio means life, security means protection. So biosecurity is basically just life protection. It's all of the practices and the protocols and all the steps we take and the things we do for the prevention of disease or for reducing the spread of that disease should it occur. So why is biosecurity important? Well, it's important to prevent the spread of disease if it does appear. It's important to help keep our flocks healthy, and it's important for the profitability of our flocks. So biosecurity is a major concern right now because of the avian influenza threat that's going on in the United States. Avian influenza is now in all four of the major U.S. flyways. It started in the Atlantic flyway back December and January, and it's gradually moved across the country through the Mississippi flyway where we're located, also the Central flyway and the Pacific flyway along the West Coast. And the threat for avian influenza will exist at least for a while longer yet, at least until the temperatures reach 65 degrees or reach 85 degrees on a consistent basis, and whenever the migration season is over for migratory waterfowl, which tend to carry the disease but do not show symptoms. Now, there is no cure for avian influenza. So biosecurity, again, is the best defense that we have against this disease and several other diseases as well. Biosecurity is what we hear about the most when we start talking about avian influenza, but there are a lot of different diseases that biosecurity also helps us keep out of our flocks, and we'll talk about some of these as we go through this. So biosecurity is made up of three major important elements. These are isolation. So isolation is basically confining your birds within a controlled environment. In our case, we keep birds in chicken houses. We move birds inside for a reason. The diseases are outside. The things that tend to want to eat chickens are outside. All the varmints and the critters are outside. So we moved them inside to protect them and to try to keep them isolated, to keep them away from the disease threat, to keep them away from predators. And it's important to keep other birds out of our house. You know, we don't want anything in there but chickens. We don't want to see sparrows in the house. We don't want to see starlings in the house because, again, these birds can bring in diseases from outside. So it's important to keep the doors locked, to keep anybody and anything out of the house that you don't want in the house. Traffic control is also critically important. We've got to know, what's going on. What's coming on that farm, what's leaving that farm. Traffic control is important, not just for vehicles, but also for people, for equipment, for anything that moves back and forth. You need to be aware of what's coming and going on your farm to make sure something's not being tracked onto your operation. Sanitation is also critically important. Disinfecting material, equipment, and people that work or enter the area is vitally important to make sure, again, that something is not getting on that farm that we do not want on that farm. I'll talk a little bit about cleaning shoes and foot baths. Again, foot baths can be a pain sometimes, and I'm very aware of that, but everyone should be using foot baths. So use the foot bath both when you enter the chicken house and again when you leave. Yeah, it's a little bit extra effort to step in when you go in through your tub of dry bleach or whatever your disinfectant happens to be. Same way on the way out. But again, it's how you keep things clean and it's how you keep things disinfected. Again, if possible, have a pair of shoes or boots for each chicken house where birds are housed, and only use them in that particular chicken house. Either that or use shoe covers if possible. But again, it's very easy to track something in from outside, and you certainly do not want to do that. Cleaning and disinfection. Again, physical removal of contaminated material reduces the pathogen load that's on those shoes or boots. And again, you've got to have those things clean before you can disinfect them. Surfaces need to be as free of dirt and debris as possible before the disinfectants are actually used. Disinfectants do not work if there's a large amount of organic matter, either manure or dirt or chicken litter or whatever, present on your shoes or boots. You cannot disinfect organic matter, folks. We've got to get everything clean first and then disinfect, because again, you cannot disinfect dirt or organic matter. Application of an appropriate disinfectant can further reduce the risk of pathogens in a clean environment, but that environment's got to be clean first. Again, it's important to make sure that our shoes and boots are clean and do not have any sticking material to them before we actually disinfect them. And again, whatever we're using, there's several different products that are good disinfectants, but they all do not act the same way. So follow the directions for whatever product you are using to make sure you're using it right. Modes of transportation. How does stuff get onto your farm? We'll talk a little bit about how it can get on there, whether we know it's coming or not. Vermin are always something to have to worry about. Rats and mice can carry lots of different diseases. So we've got to be aware of what's going on, what can move on and off our farm. We've got to have a very good rodent control program in place. A lot of these things can be airborne, at least for short distances. You know, in the case of avian influenza, we didn't used to think it moved on the air, but we learned back in 2015 with the big AI break in the Midwest that it can move on the air, at least for short distances. And then there's always a chance of inadvertently moving something on or off a farm that we're not aware of, either through human movement, machine movement, vehicle movement, whatever. Likely the most common method of something getting onto a farm is someone tracking something into the chicken house, and they didn't know they were tracking it in there. Feral poultry is also a risk. You know, a lot of people that have commercial poultry farms are neighbors with folks that have backyard chickens, and sometimes these backyard chickens can come and go as they please. But again, chickens coming on to your property that don't belong on that property are a risk. Waterfowl is also a particular risk, especially migrating waterfowl, ducks and geese. Ducks seem to be more of a problem than what geese do, but migrating waterfowl is a lot of what's causing all the problems that we're having this year right now, because they can carry the virus, but they don't necessarily get sick, or they don't often get sick. You know, they have it and they can carry it and they can transmit it, but it really doesn't bother them to the degree that it bothers some of our other feathered creatures. Water. Your viruses can live in water for a long time. So if there's a water supply close by, I don't care whether it's a pond, a lake, or mud hole in your driveway, water is a risk factor. Fecal material. Again, these migrating waterfowl that are carrying the virus they're carrying can be secreted in the nasal secretions from these birds, but also in the fecal material from these birds. So if a flock of birds flies over your farm and drops manure between house 1 and house 2, and you walk through it and track it into either house 1 or house 2, you can put the virus in there by that method, because the virus is actually in the fecal material of these migrating waterfowl. And there's vertical transmission for some diseases that can be transmitted from the hen into the egg, and then when the chick hatches, it can get the virus that way. So avian influenza vectors. Again, migrating waterfowl is a big risk right now because the virus is in the nasal secretions and it's in the manure. Again, it can also be airborne, at least for certain short distances. We can also track it either on our boots, on the wheels of our vehicles. We can move it from place to place. We may not know we're moving it, and in most cases, I tend to think that's how a lot of these farms are becoming infected, is that folks don't know that they're moving the virus into the chicken house. Again, also in the water supply, because the virus can live a long time in the water. Movement of staff, movement of materials, movement of vehicles between farms is also another risk factor. And the movement of poultry from one place to another. A lot of folks that have backyard chickens that go to shows or swap meets or things like this, they can move their poultry off the farm and they're perfectly healthy, but if they pick up something at a show or a swap meet or a flea market or wherever those chickens are being, and the folks bring it back home, they can infect the rest of their flock with this. Again, rodents, rats, and mice. You've got to have a strong biosecurity program in place for rodent control. It doesn't do no good to have a program in place or have bait stations out if you don't keep those stations baited. And again, airborne from infected sites. So again, if a farm does break, how fast we can get that farm depopulated and get that infected flock out of circulation is key to making sure that the virus does not spread anywhere else. So what exactly is avian influenza and why are we hearing so much about it? Well, it's a respiratory disease, and there's a bunch of respiratory diseases that chickens can get, but this one is a very, very serious one. It's a disease caused by infection with avian influenza type A viruses. Now, there's multiple forms of avian influenza viruses, and there's multiple strains of these viruses. We are hearing a lot right now about H1N1, but there are multiple forms of H, there are multiple forms of N. What is really serious is if the H, and all of these are designated by numbers, if what we are dealing with is an H5 or an H7, it's much more serious than what it is if the H is some other number, because H5s and H7s tend to mutate from low pathogenic to high pathogenic. And low pathogenic is not that deadly to the birds themselves, but again, it can mutate and become high pathogenic, which is very, very deadly. So these viruses, again, occur naturally in wild aquatic birds. Things like ducks and geese and gulls and shorebirds, birds that hang around the water, tend to have a lot of these viruses but don't show symptoms, but they are able to transmit it. They're found worldwide, and they can infect domestic poultry such as our chickens, turkeys, quail, pheasants, guineas, and these creatures are very, very susceptible to it. It may not bother the wild birds all that much or the waterfowl all that much, but it is certainly dangerous for chickens and turkeys and quail and pheasants and guineas and domesticated poultry. Again, AI is not the only threat that's out there. Yeah, we hear a lot about avian influenza right now, and it does get most of the attention, but there are a lot of other serious disease threats out there that biosecurity is our best defense against. And it's basically just common sense safety type practices to protect our flocks from multiple disease challenges. Biosecurity is not difficult, but it does require a little extra time and a little extra effort on our part to make sure that we've got a strong biosecurity program in place that will lessen the chance that our flock is going to become infected with something we don't want it to have. Again, it's just simple, common sense type stuff that we need to do to protect our flocks, not only from avian influenza, but from a whole host of other multiple disease challenges. Some of these other challenges include, besides avian influenza, and again, there's various strains that have different levels of severity and transmission with avian influenza, but it's not the only one that we need to worry about. Infectious laryngotracheitis is also very, very serious, and we have to take precautions. Same way with infectious bronchitis, infectious bursal disease, salmonella, other bacteria like E. coli, mycoplasma, other viruses such as Marek's and Newcastle disease, parasites like coccidia that causes coccidiosis, and fungi such as aspergillosis or brood pneumonia. All of these things are things that we need to have biosecurity in place for to try to prevent it from ever coming onto our farm. It's a whole lot easier to prevent something than it is to deal with something after it occurs. So what can we do? What are the things that we need to be concerned about, and what are the things we need to do to take steps to try to make sure that disease does not come onto our farm? Well, there's a whole host of practices that we'll go through. Again, post no visitors and restricted area signs at road entrances. You know, the backyard folks are not really very good about doing this, but commercial folks usually have, whoever their integrator is, usually have no visitors or biosecurity area or restricted zone or whatever at the road entrance. Also, do not allow visitors to your birds and do not visit other poultry farms. Again, it's very easy to track something from one place to another. So traffic control is one of the major ways to try to cut down the risk that something's going to come or go that you don't want onto your property. So again, do not allow visitors to your birds, and you do not go visit other folks' birds. Again, we talked about this, but dedicate footwear and clothing to be used when you're only working in or near your flock. That doesn't spend any time anywhere except right there at the farm. Essential visitors, and you're going to have some of those folks. You know, you're going to have repair personnel come along sometimes if you've got something that breaks down in the chicken house. So you may have to have repair personnel on your property. The propane driver is going to have to show up. FedEx, UPS, other delivery personnel are going to have to show up on your farm, but they don't need to be anywhere around your chickens. Or if they are, you need to make sure that they're going to wear disposable coveralls, footwear, headgear, if they have any reason at all to be anywhere near your flock of chickens. Again, know who comes and goes. Monitor all vehicles that enter that farm to determine if they've been cleaned and disinfected, including the tires and the undercarriage. You know, your service techs are probably spraying their tires whenever they get onto your property to try to make sure they don't track something off the highway onto your farm. Maybe the feed truck drivers do the same thing. But again, know who comes and goes, and make sure that anybody that gets down close to where your chicken houses are, make sure that those vehicles are cleaned and disinfected. Do not keep feed or other food sources out for wild birds on your property to try to attract birds, because again, anything that you bring onto that property, you know, is a threat to your chickens. Some folks tend to want to use sound deterrents if they've got a lot of birds that tend to hang around and roost close to the property or on the property. You know, again, they can get used to sound deterrents if you use them too often. So if you do use them, you know, use them judiciously. Again, maintain an effective rodent control program. It doesn't do any good to have those bait stations out if you don't bait them on a regular basis and check them to make sure that they've got bait out. Do not share equipment with friends or neighbors. Now, this does not mean that you can't be neighborly, but again, sharing equipment and things moving from farm to farm is a serious risk factor. So if you do share equipment, and a lot of folks do, if you do share equipment, make sure it is cleaned first and then disinfected before it leaves your farm. And when it gets ready to come back, make sure it is cleaned first and then disinfected before it comes back onto your farm. Bird and varmint proof your houses as best you can. You know, you don't want sparrows, you don't want starlings in your house, you don't want rats, you don't want mice in your house. So again, bird and varmint proof those houses as best you can. Again, all persons entering poultry facilities should be using the foot baths. Now, every door may not have foot baths in front of it, but the folks that go in and out need to be using the doors that have the foot baths to make sure that they can step into that disinfectant before they step into the chicken house. Now, foot baths are going to have to be cleaned and changed every so often, because if you want them to maintain their effectiveness, they don't last forever. Even dry bleach gets a lot of litter tracked into it after a while. And all that organic matter in there is cutting down on the effectiveness of that dry bleach. So it's got to be changed every once in a while. You know, maybe dry bleach doesn't have to be changed as often as what a liquid disinfectant bath does, but foot baths do have to be changed from time to time if they're going to be effective. Wash your hands, use hand sanitizers before and after visiting your birds. Again, just to make sure that you're not tracking somewhere back and forth as you go. Keep houses locked to avoid unwanted entrance. You know, you don't want anybody in that house that's not supposed to be in that house. So keep your doors locked. Dispose of dead birds in an approved manner. You know, in most cases, that's either going to be composting or incineration. There are a few folks that still do use freezers, but they are beginning to be phased out more so than what they have been in the past. And composting and incineration are the two most common methods that we use these days. So make sure you dispose of dead birds in an approved manner, and make sure you keep those dead birds picked up every day. Hunters and anyone handling wild game, again, especially waterfowl, must completely change clothes and shower or bathe before going back to the chicken houses. This can work the same way even if you leave the farm and go to town. If you have to go get parts at the poultry supply store, you go get feed at the co-op, you know, other chicken folks go to the same places that you go to. And if they track something into the store and it falls off their boots and you pick it up on your boots and take it home and go right back to the chicken house, you can track it into the chicken house. So again, even if you have to go get parts or go get feed, when you come back home, don't run down there and check the chickens in the same clothes and the same boots that you wore to town. You know, change clothes, change boots to make sure that you're not going to track something off the farm onto the farm. Remove standing water as best you can. You know, if you've got a lot of mud holes in your driveway, fill those things in so that they don't attract wild birds. They don't want to be taking bird baths in your mud holes. You don't want to have any more wild birds on your property than what you just absolutely have to. Do not feed wildlife and try to attract them onto your property because, again, they move from place to place, from farm to farm. You don't want them bringing in something that you don't want. You'll manage the risk around ponds and basins. Again, open water is a risk factor because it tends to attract waterfowl, especially if you've got a pond or a lake or something on your property. Do not use untreated surface water as a water source, either drinking water for your chickens or water that you use to clean and wash feed trays or anything else. You know, years and years ago when I first started servicing chickens, and this is back in the early 80s, I had several growers that had big ponds or small lakes on their property, and that's what they used as a water source for their drinking water for their chickens. We do not do that these days just because the biosecurity threat is too great of picking up something that we don't want those chickens to have. So do not use untreated surface water as a water supply. Again, minimize food sources for wild birds and other animals. The less critters that you have that come and go on your property, again, think traffic control. The less traffic you've got moving on and off your property, the less likely it is that something's going to track something onto your property. Avoid lethal removal of wild birds to prevent the spread of high pathogenic avian influenza because there's just too many of them out there for lethal removal to be an option. Mow frequently to prevent the grass from going to seed and providing a food source for wild birds. Again, if you keep the grass mowed to the fact that it never has seed heads on it and it's not an attraction to wild birds to come and eat grass seed, you know, you're better off. As much as possible, prevent nesting sites around the chicken houses. But be aware that it's unlawful to remove nests with eggs or young birds in them at any time of the year. So if something's trying to build a nest, and starlings are very bad about wanting to build nests underneath the hood of the propane tank. Keep an eye on what's going on, and if you see that, you know, pull that nest before that bird begins to make a nest and has eggs or baby birds in that nest. This is a map of where the sites have been up to this point, and this is accurate up through May the 9th, of confirmed high-path avian influenza cases in the U.S. as of May the 9th. Now, the red circles are the commercial farms where AI has been reported. The blue dots are non-commercial farms, or they're more backyard type facilities. You see the heaviest concentration in the Midwest, again, similar to what it was in 2015. Iowa, Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota had a lot of sites that have broken with high-path avian influenza. Several of these are turkey operations, several of these are cage laying operations, but this is the sites, at least through May the 9th, of where there's been confirmed avian influenza cases this year. And as you can see, it pretty much goes all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast. So it is in all 4 flyways. Knock on wood, but up to this point, the Deep South has been fairly lucky in terms of not having avian influenza breaks. This next map is similar to the last map, except it has a lot of orange pins put into it. All of these little orange pins are where there's been wild bird that have been diagnosed with avian influenza since the first of the year. Again, you see it pretty much similar, goes from the East Coast to the West Coast, with the heaviest concentration being in the Midwest. So, as of May the 11th, 306 confirmed flocks have tested positive for high-path avian influenza this year. Some of these are commercial farms, some of them are backyard farms, but 176 of this total 306 has been in commercial flocks. And some of these commercial flocks are huge, folks. I mean, some of these cage layer flocks have millions of birds on a single operation. And if one bird on a facility tests positive, every bird is euthanized. And again, some of these farms have 2, 3, 4, 5 million head of cage layers on there. And there's been 130 backyard flocks. Not as many birds on these, so the numbers are not as great in terms of how fast the total number of birds added up, but it is still, a serious situation in terms of the number of backyard flocks that have been affected. Up to this point, 34 states have reported at least one positive case. By far, Iowa has had the most in terms of numbers. Iowa has lost about 13.5 million head so far. Again, many of these are cage-laying chickens, and they are on farms that have lots of birds, 2, 3, 4, 5 million head on one operation. Nebraska is in second place right now in terms of total numbers with approximately 5 million head, and Pennsylvania is third with roughly 4 million head. To date, 37.72 million birds have been affected. This is not as many as what it was back in 2014, 2015, when the last big break of avian influenza happened in this country, but 38 million birds is still a big hit in terms of avian influenza losses, and it's by far the biggest hit that we've had since the 2014-2015 outbreak. It is suspected, it hasn't been confirmed everywhere yet, but it is suspected that a breach in biosecurity may have been responsible for many of these cases. So most likely what has happened, somebody has tracked something into a chicken house and didn't know they tracked it in. Because again, we cannot control where the ducks and the geese are going to fly on their migration routes. And again, if they drop manure on our property and we track it into the chicken house, we've put the virus there because the virus is in the manure. So that's why we've got to be careful in terms of how we manage our biosecurity entering and leaving our chicken houses, because it is going to be very easy for us to track something in and not actually know that we tracked anything in. So extreme caution and enhanced biosecurity practices are certainly warranted until the migration season is over this year and the temperatures consistently reach at least 85 degrees every day. You know, a lot of these respiratory viruses are not near as prominent in hot weather as what they are in cold weather. They're just not a hardy virus in terms of being able to withstand a lot of hot weather. But it's got to get hot and it's got to stay hot day after day to lessen the threat. And right now, we're not at that point yet. So to kind of summarize all this stuff, again, biosecurity is all the practices, all the protocols, all the protection that we use to prevent disease or lessen its spread should it occur. You know, we don't want it to get on our farm, but if it does get on our farm, we don't want to be the person that spreads it somewhere else. So biosecurity is our best defense against avian influenza and a bunch of other serious diseases. So we've got to have a strong biosecurity program in place, and we've got to follow that biosecurity program. It doesn't do us any good if we have a biosecurity program that's written down somewhere that we don't follow. So growers should take every biosecurity precaution right now to protect their flocks and the flocks of others. Everyone must be vigilant and must be extremely careful not to track something into their chicken houses between now and the time the weather gets hot and stays hot, because right now is a critical period and it's easy for us to do. Migration season is still going on. We don't know whether we've walked through manure or not going from one house to another. So we've got to be careful in terms of how we manage biosecurity, use those foot baths, and make sure that we're not carrying something into the chicken house that's going to make all our chickens sick. With that, I'll say thank you for your time and good luck with your chickens.